Afternoon. I apologize for being a bit late. Actually, I had lectures at the university, at Moscow State University, yesterday and today, so I was late for the beginning of the conference. But anyway, I'm glad I made it. In fact, I came at 3 here, just after you left. And I followed you to the library, but it turned out that the ladies working here told me about the main building of the library on the Nevsky Ostrovsky Street. So I didn't make it. I'm sorry. I hope you enjoyed the excursion. So my topic is documents of Japanese colonial administration as a source of study of Japanese governance in Korea. In the present, many of the historical events and processes are being revised and reviewed, and the quest for new resources of scientific research, new documents, and information is becoming one of the priorities in historical science. And of course, this can be fully related to Japanese and Korean colonial history. Actually, I was conducting research of Japanese and Korean pre-war history, that is 1910, 1945. It is obvious that because Korea has been a Japanese colony for 35 years, there has been a lack of documents and materials on this particular period. Furthermore, it is well known that certain aspects of colonial Korean history have been misinterpreted, especially the history of the 20s and the 30s. Documents of Japanese colonial administration can be a good source of scientific research of pre-war, both Japanese and Korean history, as I said. Actually, I have conducted research using as a scientific base Japanese documents for official use, published by the Japanese General Governor's Office in the 20s, 30s, and early 40s in Seoul. Actually, they are all, of course, written in Japanese. Actually, it's bungo. It was, well, not easy to master, read and translate the books. Actually, I was lucky enough to have a chance to work with these documents and books in the private library of a family of a former Russian diplomat working at the Russian consulate in Seoul in the late 30s and the 40s. I have conducted research of Japanese governance of Korea in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. I tried to analyze the documents of Japanese colonial administration published, as I said, by the Governor General's Office, that is police and court. Compiled for pragmatic and practical purposes, these documents were being used by senior Japanese colonial officials. They provide us an original source of scientific research and a broad framework of inquiry concerning situation in various, let's say, situation in Korea, in colonial Korea, including strategy and tactics of Japanese governance itself, as well as methods of liberation movement suppression. Japanese colonial governance in Korea has been a topic for scientific research for a number of Russian and foreign Orientalists. For long, a tendency of accusing the Japanese colonial rule for oppression and sufferings it caused prevailed. Yet recently, a number of scholars have been conducting research highlighting Japanese colonial administration's reforms and transformation of the Korean society. One group of researchers followed the so-called national historical paradigm. that exaggerates Japan's abuses of individual Koreans, spotlights Korean victimization, and glorifies all forms of anti-Japanese resistance. It accuses the Japanese of perverting Korea's natural historical development, denying modernization of the Korean society. Another group of researchers yields to the so-called colonial development theory. It states that when Korean history is placed in a wider global context, Japan's colonial practices are shown in a more moderate light. These scholars do not deny the sufferings of the Korean people. They merely try to expand the analytical framework to include the ways that Koreans benefited. While examining colonial modernity, scholars analyze the transformation of traditional society into modern age, look at social, economic, and technological innovations. I want to stress that the Japanese governance in Korea needs to be shown in a complex of development. The facts of the colony's exploitation and modernization should not be either underestimated nor absolutized. One has to have a more balanced approach. The main and prevailing characteristics of Japanese colonial policy have been, of course, exploitive, but it also has elements of modernization of economic and social life. Talking of the system of governance in the colony, we need to talk about the means and ways of the liberation movement's suppression. The above mentioned Japanese documents, documents published by the Governor General's office, can be called, in the full meaning of the word, a primary source of scientific study. According to them, the colonial administration took into account the internal and external conditions, both stimulating and limiting the struggle of Korean people for liberation. This involves many factors: economic, political, religious, and ethic. The the national character, the course of leaders of different political liberal forces, the specific peculiarities of the country. We can conclude that though different periods, suppressive measures in the governance system prevailed, an ideological system of control and management was formed. It combined aggressiveness and circumspection, cruelty and ability to adjust oneself to different circumstances, particularly in the sphere of Korean national traditions. Japanese governance was maneuverable and flexible, combining numerous well thought out measures. As I mentioned earlier, these Japanese documents show different aspects of Korean colonial history, including Koreans' struggle for independence. As I said, these books provide us important data concerning situation in Korea in general during these 35 years. Including Korean liberation movement, spreading light on unknown facts, giving new information about its periods and personalia. This research can help us to highlight the periods of the struggle for independence during 35 years of colonial Japanese governance and give their characteristics. The documents shed light on strategy and tactics of Japanese colonial rule, various methods of liberation movement suppression. Due to the active rational colonial governance. In the second half of the 30s and first half of the 40s, practically all anti-Japanese resistance was driven out from the country, transforming into partisan activity. Nevertheless, I believe that all streams of liberation movement made their certain contribution to the Korean people's struggle for independence. This concerns groups, underground organizations acting in the late 10s, 20s, and the first half of the 30s, as well as Korean patriots acting in the mid and late 30s and early 40s, as well as partisans in Manchuria. Earlier, I stressed the importance of analyzing the documents of Governor General. In my opinion, these documents would certainly help to broaden and amplify the scientific source of information on one hand, and to confirm or disprove some aspects of concepts of Russian, mostly Soviet period researchers, and to correct and revise some conclusions, conceptions, and characteristics. What I mean is mostly the North Korean researchers' concepts who, serving the cult of Kim Il-sung and the Chuchye doctrine, crudely misinterpreted historical facts, especially concerning the 20s and the 30s, to define matters which need further scientific research on the other. I would like to say that a few more words about actually the books, the publications themselves, and maybe name some of them, the ones that I mostly made research of and analyzed. The documents of Japanese Colonial Administration can be classified as analytical, strategic, information bulletins, and others, mostly surveys. The first group can be represented by the book. I hope I can, you all understand Japanese, so I will read it in Japanese. 最近における朝鮮治安状況, which in English I translated like the present state of social tranquility in Korea. This book was published, actually it has a signed secret, and it was published in Seoul in 1939. Written, as can be seen from the text, not only by police officials, but also by researchers. Such questions as liberal movement and others are being touched upon there. Special attention is paid to left-wing radical movement, to their leaders, patriotic organizations of all kinds. An attempt to make a periodization along with showing the peculiarities and tendencies of the Koreans' liberal movement is being made there. A lot of facts. How much more time do I have? Okay. A lot of facts concerning the methods of the liberation movement's suppression, the so-called ideological crimes, can be found there. All kinds of reports, summaries of operations, details of the trials of those who took part in the struggle. This book divides the liberation movement into two main streams: the leftist, being led by the communists, or being somehow identified with them, and the nationalist stream. Special attention is being paid to the problem of their joint actions, any ties between them, and possible measures that could prevent the formation of the so-called joint front. From the same point of view, materials concerning Korean religious organizations found in the book can also be considered to be very important. A special section is devoted to legal, not forcible methods of Korean people's struggle for independence. movement for autonomy, participation in parliamentary elections, and others. A special chapter called about social tranquility shows how conscious and worried was the Japanese colonial administration about the state of mind of Korean people, their dissatisfaction about the colonial policy in the 30s, about the beginning of the war in China. The so-called special measures, including not only repressions, but also the formation in the colony of all kinds of pro-Japanese organizations and propaganda, are shown very vividly. As the whole, as the authors of the book point, the leftist movement was considered by the colonial administration to be an influential force of liberal movement, particularly up to the end of the 20s. The above mentioned publications, along with pointing the leadership of Moscow is written of Soviet Russia, meaning Soviet Russia, in the activities of its left-wing stream, mentions the big role of the Chinese Communist Party in the Korean partisan or guerrilla movement in Manchuria, as well as in the formation of the joint anti-Japanese front. There is a great amount of interesting, useful information about the liberation movement, its different aspects and periods in the series of the so-called ideological review. That is how I translated publications, books. Actually, there is a series of them. Shisoiho. I had a chance to work with or to analyze those published in 1934, 1936, several editions, 1937 and 1938. Try to analyze them. These publications have details about so-called big ideological crimes in Korea, reports from the trials and arrests of members of the underground groups, the so-called red unions of workers, peasants, and so on, that were striving for the country's liberation. New data concerning the leaders of the patriotic organization can be found here. The books have information about the public state of mind, not only of Korean people in their homeland, but also those living in Japan and China. On the whole, the Shisoiho editions, the ideological review editions, unlike the above mentioned the state of social tranquility, Saikin ni okeru chousenjian joukyo. Unlike that edition, book, the Shisoiho editions deal with general problems of Korean liberation movement. It has valuable information revealing the punitive methods of the Japanese administration, about the state of mind of the Koreans' public opinion, as well as the position and goals of different political forces that led their activity on the Korean soil. Such publications as Chosen Keisatsu Gaiyo, Korean Police. This book was, actually they're like brochures. I wouldn't say they're hardcover books, they're brochures, but pretty thick brochures. This one was published in 1938. And another one, which I want to introduce to you, Koto Keisatsu Yogo Jiten, the Dictionary of Secret Police. Both have signs, secret, and even, yes, secret. Can also indeed be considered to be of great importance to researchers. The first book publishes facts and figures about the number of nature of the infringes of the law about arrests in all of the Korean provinces in the period of 1921-1937, about the activities of the Korean guerrillas. One of the chapters devoted to the problem of providing public tranquility writes about the people's struggle for independence and its suppression by the police and gendarmerie during the long period from Korea's annexation in 1910. The book gives us the opportunity to picture the whole structure of the military and police regime functioning in the colonial country. For instance, the system of surveillance and detection. Another information publication, the one that I mentioned, the Dictionary of Secret Police, is in a way an aid for secret detection. As I said, and I want to repeat actually, so they were publications for official use, not just for everybody, for those working at the Governor General's office. So this one is in a way an aid for secret detection. It contains a lot of facts about the biggest Korean patriotic and underground organizations and their short characteristics. The main attention is being paid to the leftist organizations. It also explains, interprets many terms such as national liberation, social struggle, capitalism, socialism, social democracy, and others. Thus, the book not only has specific information, but also shows us the colonial administration's interpretation of the events and problems of Korean liberation movement and situation in the world in general. As was stated above, surveys represent another group of documents published by the Japanese Colonial Administration. They help us reveal the situation in the country. Among them are such publications, it's a number of brochures actually, all being a part of the so-called Chosen Sotokufu Jikyoku Taisaku Chosa Shimongan Sankosho, a very long title or name of the book, which can be translated like Materials for the Committee for the Governor General's Office Study of Special Measures. That was published in Seoul in 1938. On the whole, I want to conclude saying again about the significance of the documents of Japanese Colonial Administration, that is the General Governor's Office, as a source of scientific research of both Japanese and Korean colonial history. This research can broaden the factual basis of both history and historiography. Different aspects of Japanese colonial governance on the whole, on the one hand, and situation in Korea, different aspects of situation in Korea, including Korean liberation movement on the other. Furthermore, the analysis of these documents can help researchers to review some previous interpretation, sometimes misinterpretation and conceptions, to help promote fundamental Japanese and Korean studies. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. Any questions from the room? Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. Are these materials published, or were they ever published somewhere in Japan or Korea? Are they unique materials, or are there like a large quantity of documents of
Thank you
this
for
type?
thank you for your question. Actually, it's a very, let's say, meaningful question. They were not republished, so they were once published by the General Governor's Office. They are documents for official use. Actually, being used by Japanese officials who worked in Korea. As I said, they were all in Japanese, of course, and in Bungo. Yes, and actually, well, it's not a secret how I got them. Actually, I said that I had the chance to work with these books in library of family. Actually, it was these people were my relatives, my husband's grandfather, who was vice consul of Russia in Seoul during the war. He worked there up till 1945. And when the Japanese capitulated, they were very fast. I mean, they tried to be fast moving out from Korea. Many of them, of course, tried to make it as fast as possible. And many of the documents were either burned down, some were taken to bookshops. I guess some were being sold by the officials who needed money, of course. And you understand that people working in the Russian consulate were, I wouldn't use the word spy, but they worked for the Russian government. So I believe they took advantage of these books being, I don't know, not locked up somewhere, but they had a chance to take them. And these documents were, these books were brought to Moscow. And they were kept in boxes in closet of my relative, grandfather of my husband, who after coming back from Korea, started doing Korean studies. She was one of, let's say, people who actually studied the colonial period of Korean history, but she couldn't read neither Japanese or, of course, Korean. Well, these books were in Japanese. So when I married my husband, she, of course, knew that I had Japanese in school at the university, and we had special course in Bungo, and I majored in history. So she said, you should make a PhD, you should study, because they are unique in a way, because most of them were destroyed. So in a way, they are unique. And I tried to, well, find similar editions while being in Japan in the early, I think it was 2010 or something like that, early 10s. I was told that, actually I didn't see them, but I was told them some of them were kept in some libraries of certain, well, universities. The one one professor mentioned in Toshoku Daigaku, which dealt with colonial history. They had some, but both the Japanese researchers and, as far as I know, those working in the United States, and some in South Korea, which, let's say, made research, conducted research of the colonial period, they sometimes referred to them, saying that the Japanese documents of the colonial administration write so and so, but they didn't give the name of the books, the pages of the books, so they just referred to them in general. So answering your questions, to be short, some of these books, I mean, there must have been many, of course, editions, can be found somewhere in Japan, maybe, but in fact, this, let's say, archive that I usually actually have in my house at home, are unique in a way, and I was just lucky to get them from let's say, the people who were actually staying in Korea during the war and brought them back to Russia, to Moscow.
Satisfied? Yes. Okay. Thank you. Do we have something online or somebody else here still? No. Nobody online. Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. It was very informative.